My son stood up at the reading of my husband's will and said, "There's nothing left for you, Mom." I just sat there. I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. This was the boy I raised, the one I used to sit with on the front porch every night after dinner. And now he stood in a conference room full of lawyers and strangers, reading off my erasure like it was a bullet point on a checklist. He didn't stutter, didn't look unsure. He sounded proud. His voice didn't shake. He didn't even glance my way when he said it. But when the lawyer at the table, George's old friend Harold, started to laugh under his breath, something shifted. Not loud laughter, just a quick, strange sound like someone had coughed at the wrong time. But I noticed it, and so did Ronald. His whole face changed for a second. That was when I realized something was off. Really off. Before I go on with my story, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button and subscribe. What would you do if your own child tried to take everything you built? I had spent 44 years by George's side. I was there before he made his first million flipping old rentals. I was there when he fell off the roof in '89. I was there when he was diagnosed and started forgetting where he kept his house keys. I was there for all of it. But now, my name wasn't in his will. Not once. Ronald kept reading. He held the folder like he was presenting at a board meeting. Calm, polished, no hesitation. All residential and commercial properties, including the Ashland Lake House, shall pass into the direct ownership of Ronald Lewis. He read, "The trust previously held jointly shall now be overseen solely by Ronald Lewis, with full discretion. No mention of me. No mention of the home George and I built together. No mention of the medical accounts I had helped manage. Just Ronald." Over and over again. His wife Celeste sat 2 chairs away from him, legs crossed, smiling slightly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her face said enough. The rest of the room was quiet, except Harold. I caught him glancing at me with this strange look, like he was biting his tongue. And then he did it again, that quiet little laugh that didn't fit the moment at all. "Is something funny?" Ronald asked, still holding the folder. Harold blinked, sat up straighter. No, please continue." But I could see it now. He knew something, and Ronald knew he knew. Ronald finished reading, then snapped the folder shut like it was final. "There's nothing more to discuss," he said. "Everything has already been signed and filed with the court. We're just here out of courtesy." Out of courtesy. That was how he saw this. Like I should be grateful I was even invited to the reading of my own husband's will. I looked around. No one made eye contact. The banker on Ronald's left checked his watch. The woman from the firm nodded and started collecting papers. It was done. I had been cut out, and no one seemed surprised. Not even me, if I'm being honest. I think part of me had already known something was coming. I just didn't expect it to be this cruel. Harold cleared his throat. "I'd like to speak with Catherine privately after this," he said. Ronald's jaw tightened. "We've covered everything. There's nothing left to go over." Harold turned to him and said, "I wasn't made aware of these changes until today. I'd like a few minutes." Celeste looked annoyed. She leaned in and whispered something to Ronald. He didn't respond, just stood up, nodded to the others, and walked out. Celeste followed behind him like a shadow. When the room cleared out, it was just me and Harold. He didn't speak right away. He just sat there, watching the door like he wanted to make sure Ronald wasn't coming back. Then he looked at me and said, "That wasn't the last will I prepared for George." I stared at him. "What?" He nodded. "That version, the one Ronald read, I didn't draft that. George never told me he changed anything. He always insisted that if anything needed revising, I'd be the one to handle it." My heart was pounding, but I didn't say a word. He came to see me 3 months before he passed. Harold continued. Said he wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of. He mentioned Ronald was getting more involved than usual, but he didn't sound worried, just tired. I felt that. The tired part. I had seen it in George's eyes every day during his last weeks. Harold reached into his briefcase and slid a sealed envelope across the table. I can't say more until I look into this properly, but I thought you should have this. I kept a copy of the original. I picked up the envelope, holding it like it might vanish if I gripped it too tight. Harold stood up, adjusted his coat, and said, "Call me tomorrow. And don't mention this to Ronald." "Not yet." I nodded. I walked out of that building with that envelope in my bag and something new in my chest. Not hope, not yet, but something. Because when my son stood up and said I was out of the will, I believed him. But when Harold laughed, that laugh told me everything wasn't what it seemed. And I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Have you ever had someone close to you say something that broke your heart like that? Leave a comment below. I read every single one. After the reading, I didn't go back to the main house. I wasn't welcome there anymore. Ronald and Celeste had already taken over like it belonged to them. They said they were renovating. That's what Ronald told me, like I was a tenant being pushed out for upgrades. He said, "We need the space cleared out so we can get started. You'll be more comfortable in the garage apartment anyway. It's smaller, easier for you." That apartment was never meant to be lived in full-time. It had no heat, no insulation, and the plumbing groaned every time I turned on the tap. George used it as a workspace in the winter just to get some quiet. I had helped him clean it out after his last hospital visit. It still smelled like old paint and pine cleaner. They didn't even give me time to pack up my things. Most of what we owned was already boxed, labeled, and pushed into one of the guest rooms. Ronald hired movers without asking. I walked into my own kitchen that evening and saw strangers wrapping up my dishes like I had passed away too. That night, I sat on the small twin bed in the garage apartment with my coat still on. The heater was broken, and the wind came through the cracks around the window. I stared at the floor for what felt like hours. I didn't cry. There was no energy left for that. I just kept thinking, how did we get here? George and I had built that house together from the ground up. We chose the floor tiles, the light fixtures, even the drawer handles. Every corner had a memory. Every wall held something we had touched. Now, it felt like a stranger's house. And somehow, I had become the stranger. During George's last year, Ronald started showing up more often. At first, I thought he was finally coming around. George had always hoped they'd be closer. They used to fight about money. Ronald thought his father was too cautious, too slow with decisions. George used to say, "Money moves fast, but I don't. And that's why we're not broke." But suddenly Ronald was everywhere, answering George's phone, calling the accountants, having meetings in the study. One day I found him going through George's office drawers. He said he was just getting ahead on paperwork. I let it go. George was tired, and I didn't want to start a fight. When I asked George if he was okay with Ronald handling all this, he just shrugged and said, "He means well." That was George's way. He trusted people until they gave him a reason not to. He didn't believe in double-checking family. But I noticed changes. Ronald convinced him to switch everything to digital records. He insisted on taking over calls with the lawyers and the property managers. He told George, "Don't worry, Dad. I've got it under control." I should have stepped in. I should have questioned more. But George was already dealing with enough. Some days he could barely hold a pen. And when your husband is dying, the last thing you want to do is start pointing fingers. Still, something didn't sit right. Celeste never used to come around much, but toward the end, she started showing up too. with her tablet, always taking notes, asking about insurance papers and key codes for the properties. Once, I walked into the study and saw her taking photos of documents on George's desk. She smiled and said she was helping organize things for the future. At the time, I didn't know what to make of it. Now, it's all I think about. George trusted them. I know he did. He believed in giving Ronald another chance. He thought maybe this was his way of stepping up. And maybe it was just not for the reasons we hoped. The day after the will reading, I found one of George's sweaters in the laundry basket. I sat there holding it, remembering how I used to nag him for tossing it in with the whites. He'd laugh, kiss my cheek, and promise to pay attention next time. He never did. I folded it and placed it in a box. Not because I wanted to, but because Celeste had asked the cleaners to finish up the laundry so we can clear the space. That's what she called it, clearing the space. I wasn't a widow in my own home. I was a guest they couldn't wait to get rid of. The garage apartment felt colder that night. The bed creaked when I turned. The light over the sink buzzed. And somewhere deep in my chest, something settled. Not anger. Not yet. Just silence. The kind of silence that knows what's coming before you do. And even though I didn't have a plan, I had a feeling. This wasn't over. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I knew my husband, and George wouldn't have left me with nothing. Not unless someone made sure he did. It was a Thursday, cold but clear. The kind of afternoon where the air bites at your hands if you don't wear gloves. I walked out to the shed behind the house because I couldn't sit in that little garage apartment one more minute. There wasn't much left in there besides some garden tools, a few broken chairs, and old storage bins stacked crooked on a rusted shelf. George used to call it his thinking room, even though he mostly just came out here to avoid phone calls. I pulled down a dusty blue, been labeled Christmas, but found table runners instead. The next one was heavier. Tucked behind an old tarp, I noticed a box I hadn't seen in years. It was smaller than the others, wooden, with a loose lid. Across the front, written in George's handwriting, were the letters, CL, personal. I sat on the edge of a stool and opened it. Inside were several envelopes, some yellowed with age, a couple receipts from our road trip to Colorado, and a folded church bulletin with my notes scribbled on the back. I thought it would all be junk, just old scraps George couldn't bring himself to throw away. Then I found an envelope with no stamp, no return address, just one line across the front in George's handwriting, to be opened if I'm gone. I sat still for a moment, holding it. It didn't feel real. It didn't feel like something I was supposed to be holding in a cold shed with dust in my nose and my knees freezing through my jeans. I opened it. It wasn't long, one page, but it felt like George was sitting right next to me, talking slow the way he always did when he wanted to get something just right. If you're reading this, it means I didn't get to fix what I should have. I'm sorry. I trusted Ronald more than I should have. He started pushing for changes to the trust and the business documents. Told me it was to simplify things, but I started to feel boxed out of my own life. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to worry you. That was my mistake. If anything goes sideways, call Gloria Mendoza. She helped me with some of the early paperwork. I trust her. She knows the history. She'll know what to do. I read it again. Then again. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold anymore. I didn't recognize the name, Gloria Mendoza, but George had trusted her. That was enough for me. I folded the letter and placed it in my coat pocket. Then I sat there a while longer, surrounded by bins and boxes of things no one else cared about, things I hadn't looked at in years. I kept thinking about how George had taken the time to write that. He hadn't said anything to me while he was alive. He could have told me any evening while we were drinking tea on the back porch or lying in bed listening to the ceiling fan spin. But he didn't. Maybe he thought he had more time. Maybe he thought Ronald wouldn't go through with it. He was wrong. As I sat there in that cold shed, the grief I'd been carrying started to change. It wasn't softer, but it felt sharper, more focused, like something had settled inside me and wasn't going to move again. George had left something behind, not money, not property. He'd left the truth. He didn't erase me. He knew what was happening. When I got back to the apartment, I placed the envelope in the drawer next to my bed. I didn't know what I was going to do yet. I didn't even know how to find this woman. But I knew one thing for sure. George wouldn't have left me with nothing. And now I had something Ronald didn't expect. A voice from the past that told me this wasn't over. That night, I made myself a cup of weak tea and sat by the little electric heater in the corner. I didn't open my phone, didn't call anyone. I just sat there and replayed the letter in my mind. Not everything in life needs to be loud to be clear. That letter was quiet, but it was enough. It told me I hadn't imagined what I'd seen. The late night meetings, the way Ronald had started finishing George's sentences, the bank calls he insisted on taking, the mail he intercepted and said wasn't important. It was all starting to line up. I looked around the tiny apartment at the blank walls, the sagging bookshelf, the cracked light switch, and I realized I'd been pushed aside on purpose. They didn't think I'd fight back. They thought I'd disappear. But I wasn't going to. George left a trail. I just had to follow it. It took me 2 days to find Gloria Mendoza. Her name wasn't listed in any of George's files I could find in the garage apartment. I had to call 3 old office numbers before someone gave me a cell number and told me she'd been semi-retired for a few years now, only taking on a handful of clients. When I called her, I didn't expect her to remember me. But as soon as I said, "Catherine Lewis," she paused and said, "George's wife? Of course. Come by the house tomorrow. Afternoon's best." I brought tea in a thermos. It was the only thing I had to offer. Her place was a small cottage-style home on the edge of town. Neat, quiet, a little overgrown around the garden, but everything felt lived in and warm. She met me at the door in a thick sweater, her glasses sitting low on her nose, and led me straight to the kitchen table without fuss. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said as we sat her day. I didn't want to push, but I figured something didn't feel right. I poured the tea and said softly, "George mentioned your name in a note, said you helped him with some papers before he passed." She nodded. "I did. He wasn't well, but he was clear. He wanted to make sure things were in order, and he wanted to protect you. That was the one thing he kept repeating. Catherine will be fine as long as everything's filed correctly." I swallowed hard. The will they read, it didn't have my name. Not once. Everything went to Ronald. Gloria didn't blink. She got up, walked over to a cabinet, and pulled out a slim gray laptop. It took a minute to load, and then she opened a file. "This is what George and I finalized," she said. "Printed, signed, notarized here at my table. Witnessed properly." She turned the screen toward me. There it was. My name. In the event of my passing, I leave full ownership of our shared residence, all joint accounts, and personal property to my wife, Catherine Lewis. Ronald's name was there too, but only once, under a section labeled executor. Not owner, not beneficiary. Executor only. I leaned back in my chair. I couldn't speak. I sent copies to George's primary attorney. Gloria said. He said he'd file them with the court. He always handled the official submissions. I didn't think twice. "Harold?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, someone new. Ronald gave George the contact. Said it would be easier to keep everything streamlined." I raised my eyebrow at that, but George insisted it was fine. Do you remember the name? She clicked through a few emails. Lawson and Brigg, out of Portland. I'd never worked with them before. I'd never heard of them either. This isn't the will they read. I said, No, it isn't, Gloria replied. I could feel something hardening inside me. It wasn't anger. Not yet, but it was coming. What do we do? I asked. I can't do much officially, she said. I'm not practicing full-time anymore, but I can send you everything I have. PDFs, scan logs, witness signatures. I keep backups of everything. I learned that the hard way over the years. She pulled out a USB drive and placed it on the table. This copy was never meant to disappear. And it didn't. You have it now. I held the little drive in my hand. It felt heavier than it looked. I think Ronald replaced it. I said, used another firm, cut me out completely, then told everyone it was all finalized. Sounds like he counted on you staying quiet. He's always been like that, I said, smooth on the outside, calculating underneath. George never saw it. Gloria nodded. A lot of parents don't, especially with sons. They want to believe. I packed the tea thermos and stood to leave. But before I reached the door, Gloria touched my arm. You're not crazy, she said. I saw George's face that day. He was tired, yes, but he knew what he wanted. He made sure you were taken care of. This, she nodded toward the flash drive. This proves it. I nodded. Back in the car, I didn't start the engine right away. I sat there with my hands on the wheel and stared at the houses across the street. Kids were riding scooters down the sidewalk. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. My world had felt upside down for weeks, but now I had something solid. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Ronald had made a move. He thought no one would check. But George didn't leave me behind. He trusted me to figure it out. If you were in my shoes, would you have opened that envelope or left it alone? Tap the like button and share if you believe in following your gut. Now I had proof. Now it was my turn. I hadn't planned on going into the laundry room that day. I just needed a clean towel. But once I opened the door and smelled that mix of detergent and dust, something pulled me in. It was one of the few parts of the main house Ronald hadn't touched yet. The door stuck a little, just like it always had, and the bulb overhead flickered when I flipped the switch. I stood there for a minute, staring at the corner where George kept the old utility shelf. Behind the dryer, wedged up against the wall, was the same metal cabinet we'd had since we moved in. George never labeled it, just said, if anything happens to me, check there. I never had before, not once. We kept that space for storing taxes, warranties, and all the files that felt too boring to throw out. But now, it didn't feel boring. It felt necessary. I pulled the dryer forward. The cabinet was dusty, but still locked. I found the small key on the hook above the washer, the one George always used for the shed and the mailbox. Inside were folders, neatly stacked, sorted by year. Some were thin, some thick. The first one I opened was from 2016, home maintenance receipts, then property taxes, then lease agreements for the rentals we owned downtown. But what caught my eye was a red binder buried near the bottom, almost hidden behind an envelope of roof repair photos. It was labeled simply, Trust Documents, Drafts. I sat down on the floor. Inside were 2 full drafts of the trust, one from early that year, another with a handwritten note on top. Ronald pushed me to change this. I'm holding off. The date said it was written just 3 weeks before George passed. I flipped through the pages. In the earlier version, I was listed as co-trustee. Ronald was noted as a secondary administrator in case of emergency. The language was clear. My name was on everything, bank accounts, properties, even our retirement investments. In the second version, That language had been altered, entire paragraphs crossed out. Discuss with Ronald written in the margins more than once. George had written directly on the side of one section. Not ready to remove C. Need to think more on this. I felt the paper shake in my hands. He hadn't signed either version. I grabbed my phone and took photos of every page. Slowly, carefully. I didn't want to miss a single line. Then I emailed them to Gloria with a short note. Found more. Sending now. When I stood up, my knees ached, but my focus was sharper than it had been in weeks. This was no longer about grief. It was about proof. I moved through the rest of the cabinet. There were copies of rental agreements with George's signature, bank letters confirming changes to account names. One document showed a request to move the title of our Oregon City property into a corporate trust. The form was filled out, but unsigned. And the more I looked, the more I noticed something strange. George had never followed through. He had started the changes Ronald suggested, but he hadn't finalized them. It was all half done. That told me something important. George was unsure. And if he was unsure, Ronald had no right pushing those changes forward after he died. When I closed the cabinet, I pulled the dryer back into place and wiped my hands with a towel. I didn't want anyone knowing I'd been in there. Back in the garage apartment, I sat down and started a list in an old notebook. Every date, every inconsistency, the original will from Gloria, the binder from the laundry room, the version read aloud by Ronald that didn't match either. I underlined the words, no signature, twice in red. I also wrote this. He didn't trust Ronald. He just didn't know how to say it. That evening, I called Gloria. I told her about the trust drafts, the notes, and the files I found. She asked for copies of everything. I offered to bring the originals. She agreed. Before I hung up, she said, keep everything safe. Someone's going to challenge you once they find out you've started digging. I'm counting on it, I said. That night, I locked the binder in a trunk under my bed. Not because I was scared of Ronald coming in, but because I didn't want to take any chances. There's something that happens when you see proof with your own eyes. You stop doubting yourself. You stop replaying conversations and wondering if you were too sensitive or too tired or too emotional. The documents didn't lie. George had paused. George had hesitated. And now, I had the paper trail to prove it. Would you keep digging or let it go to keep the peace? Comment, I'd dig. And subscribe if you believe some truths can't be buried. The envelope came 3 days later. No return name, just a gold stamp of the Ashland Country Club on the front. Inside was a folded card with shiny lettering that read, "You are invited to the Lewis Legacy Gala, celebrating a new era." Underneath, in small print, hosted by Ronald and Celeste Lewis. No mention of George. No mention of me. At the bottom, it said, dress formal. Dinner provided. RSVP appreciated, but not required. It was addressed to C. Lewis, guest. Not Mrs. George Lewis. Not even Mom. Just guest. I almost tossed it in the trash. But something told me to go. Not out of curiosity, out of principle. I wanted to see what Ronald was trying to build on the foundation his father laid. The Ashland Country Club hadn't changed. Same gravel path, same iron gate, same valet parking. George, and I used to come here once a year for the builder's luncheon. It never felt fancy to us, just familiar. The night of the gala, I wore a dark blue dress I hadn't touched since our anniversary dinner years ago. Simple, warm, nothing flashy. I arrived right on time. The parking lot was full. I walked in alone. The room buzzed with noise, glasses clinking, laughter, music humming in the background. A young woman at the door looked at my invitation and said, "Right this way, Mrs. Guest." I nodded. Inside, A huge banner stretched across the back wall. The Lewis Legacy, Building Tomorrow. There were printed programs at every table. Glossy photos of Ronald and Celeste standing in front of buildings they hadn't built, with captions like expanding the vision and redefining leadership. I kept walking, quiet. I wasn't there to make a scene. Ronald spotted me near the appetizer table. He didn't come over. He just gave me a polite nod, the kind you give a stranger in passing. Celeste was across the room in a red dress, talking with two developers from Portland. I recognized them from past dinners with George. I took a seat near the back, close enough to hear, but far enough not to draw attention. Half an hour in, Ronald took the stage. He tapped the microphone twice, then smiled. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he said. "This is more than a party. This is a new chapter, a new beginning. My wife Celeste and I have spent the last few months working to honor the name Lewis, not just by holding on to what came before, but by building something fresh, something bigger." The crowd applauded. He continued, "My father built a reputation, but what we're doing now is different. We're growing the brand, repositioning the assets, modernizing the operation. It's not just real estate anymore. It's legacy management. Legacy management. That's what he called it. Then he turned and said, "And to my wife, who stood by me during the hard decisions, you are the reason I was able to make this leap. Thank you for being the one voice I could count on." She smiled, her hand on her heart. The room clapped again. I didn't. George's name wasn't spoken once. Not in the speech. Not in the program. Not even on the wall of donors in the back. I walked over to the drinks table for some water. That's when I overheard two men chatting nearby, both in suits, holding wine glasses. One said, "I thought his mother would be more involved, especially with the board appointments. Surprised she wasn't given voting rights." The other shrugged. Maybe she wanted to stay out of it. But still odd. You don't usually see the widow excluded. They moved on to talking about investments. But their words stuck with me. They assumed I had stepped back, chosen silence. They had no idea I'd been pushed out. I stayed for another 10 minutes, just long enough to see Ronald shake hands with a city planner and pitch him a new mixed-use space. He spoke like the land was his, like the permits were guaranteed. I knew that property. George and I bought it in 1994. We spent weeks fixing the foundation. Ronald never laid a hand on it, but now it was a Lewis development opportunity. I slipped out through the side hallway. Outside, the air was cold and still. I took off my heels and walked barefoot across the grass to the far end of the parking lot. No one followed. No one noticed. I sat in my car and stared at the building. The windows glowed with soft lights and laughter. Inside, they were celebrating, toasting a future built on something they didn't even understand. Ronald thought he'd won. He thought branding himself was enough. He thought silence meant agreement. But what he didn't know was that the real legacy, the truth, was sitting in my glove box. And it wasn't going to stay hidden much longer. Click subscribe if you've ever had to stand your ground quietly. More real stories like this one are coming. I called Mr. Halbert the morning after the gala. I didn't need to explain who I was. He picked up and said, "I figured I'd be hearing from you again." We met that afternoon in his office, same long conference table, same quiet room. But this time, I wasn't sitting there confused. I walked in with a folder in my hand and confidence in my chest. I placed the binder, the flash drive, and a copy of George's handwritten letter on the table. I didn't speak for a moment. I wanted him to see it all before I said anything. Halbert read slowly. He flipped through the drafts, studied the trust notes. Read George's words, the part about Ronald pushing too hard. When he reached the last page, he leaned back, let out a soft laugh, and shook his head. This explains everything, he said. I knew something didn't sit right the day of the reading, but I didn't have the proof. You laughed, I said, that day, at the will reading. Quiet, but I saw it. He smiled, this time on purpose. I had a copy of George's 2022 version in my records. It named you as primary beneficiary. Nothing about a full transfer to Ronald. When they pulled out that other will, I thought, something's been switched. Why didn't you say anything then? I asked. I didn't want to raise an accusation without evidence, he said, but I flagged it, sent an internal request to search for the original submission in the registry. Took longer than expected. Then he reached into his drawer and pulled out a paper. Here's the kicker. George sent the finalized version, your version, by mail. Certified. Signed. 2 months before he died. It was supposed to arrive here for filing, but the tracking shows it was rerouted before delivery. Rerouted? I repeated. He nodded. Someone requested a change in forwarding address on George's behalf, while he was already under medication. Ronald, I said. I'd bet money on it, Halbert replied. It wasn't hard to do. People assume families won't question things, especially during end-of-life care. That's when they make their moves. So what now? I asked. I've already submitted a legal inquiry to the probate court, he said. Now that we have documentation and witness signatures from Gloria Mendoza, it's enough to move forward. He tapped the folder. This changes everything. I stared down at the papers again. I'd read them all dozens of times, but hearing Halbert confirm it made it real in a different way. Will Ronald be notified? I asked. Yes, he said. Formally, through a court summons. I'll file the motion today. He'll be served by next week. That moment didn't feel loud or dramatic. It felt quiet, steady. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just nodded, because deep down, I already knew. I got up to leave, but Halbert stopped me. Catherine, he said, you did exactly what George hoped you'd do. You paid attention. You asked the right questions. A lot of people don't. I almost didn't, I admitted, but I couldn't ignore what I saw. It didn't feel right. He nodded. Ronald may have gotten a head start, but he made one big mistake. He underestimated you. Outside the office, I took a deep breath. The sky was gray, the air sharp, but I felt calm, balanced, like I was finally standing in the right place. Back at the apartment, I put the originals back in the box, under my bed. I didn't need to do anything else. I had done my part. Now it was the court's turn. 3 days later, an envelope arrived. Official seal. My name. Inside. A notice. Petition for formal review of probate filing. Estate of George Lewis. Hearing date to be set. I didn't call Ronald. I didn't need to. A week after that, I heard from a neighbor that Ronald had been served at the country club parking lot. Said he looked confused at first, then angry, then just walked away without saying anything. I didn't celebrate. I just boiled water for tea and sat with the notice in my hands. It wasn't over, but the silence was broken, and this time, when the lawyer laughed, I laughed with him. 6 weeks after the hearing notice was filed, I got the call. The court had placed a temporary hold on all estate transactions. Ronald was no longer allowed to move assets, transfer deeds, or sign anything under the Lewis name. A few days later, I sat in the same courtroom where George and I had once finalized the papers for our second home. But this time, it was different. Ronald sat across from me in a fitted suit, looking tired. Celeste wasn't with him. His lawyer did most of the talking. He barely looked up. Gloria testified first. She spoke clearly and without hesitation. She confirmed George's original will. She explained how she printed and notarized it. She named the witnesses. Everything lined up. Then Mr. Halbert presented the file trail, the certified mailing, the postmark, the date George dropped off the envelope, and the change of address request Ronald filed without permission. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The papers did the talking. The signatures, the drafts, George's handwritten notes. The judge reviewed it all in silence. Then she looked up and said, "Based on what's been submitted, it's clear the original terms of Mr. George Lewis's estate were changed without valid cause. The position of executor is hereby reassigned. The trust will be restored to its rightful status, with Catherine Lewis as the primary. Just like that. No drama. No yelling. Just truth. Ronald wasn't charged. The judge called his actions misleading but not criminal. That was fine with me. I didn't come for punishment. I came to set things right. 2 weeks later, I received official control of the trust. Everything George built, the homes, the accounts, the land, was now in my name. Ronald called that night. He asked if we could talk. I listened. He didn't apologize, not really, but he said he'd been overwhelmed, said he thought he was doing what Dad would have wanted. I told him, "You didn't even ask what I wanted." There was silence. Then he said, "Do you want me to leave the property?" I could have said yes. I could have told him to pack up and go, but I didn't. I told him he could stay in the guest house, under one condition. He'd pay rent, on time, with a signed lease. He agreed. I sent him the paperwork the next morning. He signed it without question. That weekend, I moved back into the main house. I didn't bring much from the garage apartment, just the letter from George, the flash drive, and a folded copy of the will. The rest could stay boxed. I walked through every room slowly, ran my hand along the kitchen counter, stood in the living room where George used to read the paper, sat in the chair by the window, and looked out over the lawn. It didn't feel like taking back a house. It felt like returning to myself. I opened a drawer in the study and found a candle, one of George's favorites, cedarwood. I lit it and placed it on the table next to his chair. Then I opened the window. The breeze came in soft, light, not cold. For a moment, I didn't think about Ronald, or court, or what I'd been through. I thought about George, and how in his quiet way, he'd left me exactly what I needed. Not just the home, but the truth, the name, the place I had earned. People think legacy is about money, but it's not. Before this story ends, ask yourself, what do you want to be remembered for? Pause, scroll down, and leave your answer. Your words matter. It's about being remembered the way you lived, with honesty, with dignity, with your feet firmly planted where you belong. I was never out. I had always been in. They just tried to forget. And now they couldn't anymore. Now, I want to ask you something. What would you do if your own child tried to take everything you built? Have you ever had to fight quietly to reclaim your place in your family? And what matters more to you, what's left behind in the bank or what's left behind in your name? If this story meant something to you, please like the video, share it with a friend, and leave a comment. I'd love to hear your story too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe for more real stories like this one. Because some truths deserve to be heard more than once. V.